Evening hours at Ikim FM. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good afternoon to the dear listeners of Ikim FM. Welcome to this special interview. I'm your host Patricia Afrina. And for today's episode, I'm honored to interview Dr. Alexander Amin. Dr. Alexander Amin specializes in the Eastern Islamic world, focusing primarily on the theological, historical, and literary traditions of the Malay Muslim world, which includes modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. He earned his PhD from the University of Oxford, where his thesis examined the role of Sino-Muslims in converting the Nusantara maritime Southeast Asia to Islam from the 13th to 16th centuries. Apart from his contribution to the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology, Dr. Alexander Amin is currently involved in a significant research project that explores and re-evaluates the early history and Muslim culture of Malacca. Therefore, in this interview, we seek to look into the interesting career of Dr. Alexander Amin, who is this scholar, and what drives his intellectual curiosity. In this interview, we will explore his research interests and learn about his viewpoints on the study of Islamic civilization in Southeast Asia. Being with me in the studio today is Dr. Alexander Amin. Assalamualaikum, Doctor.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
And how are you, Doctor?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. I'm doing great, Doctor.
Good.
And before we go into the interview itself, could you first introduce a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, my name is Alexander Amin, and I'm a historian primarily of Islam in Southeast Asia.
Islam in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, so in the Malay and the Javanese worlds, over the classical period. So, from the early rise of Islam in the late 13th century through to about the 17th century.
To the 17th century. It's very interesting. So, how can you have interest into the history of just now, like you mentioned Malacca, right?
Oh,
So
Malacca. Yeah, well, sure. I mean, when I first started studying Islam, when I was an undergraduate at master's level, I studied Islam in the Middle East like everyone else, because in the UK, everybody, when you say Islam, you think about the Arab world and so on. Whereas Islam in Southeast Asia is often forgotten about. People forget about Indonesia, they forget about Malaysia or Brunei, Singapore, and so on. And even when they do remember it, they think of it as being not properly Islamic, as being kind of syncretic, as kind of mixing it with, the Bomo. They think about the Bomos,
yes.
But the more I kind of, because I've always been the kind of scholar who likes to look at the edges, the liminal spaces, the spaces around the outside, which aren't one thing or the other thing. They kind of, just where ideas flow and change and so on. So as I was studying Islam in the Middle East, I got interested in Southeast Asia because it appeared to be so different. But then the more I looked at it, the more I got into it. And as I visited here, and my wife is Malay, alhamdulillah, so that gave me an insight as well. The more I realized that this syncretism, this characterization of it not being properly Islamic, even on Java and with things like that, isn't actually true. It's actually just as Islamic as the Middle East, but in a different way, or it's been looked at in a different way by scholars, by Western scholars. Right? So Western scholars who study the Arab world, they're always philologists, so they always study manuscripts, right? But manuscripts are quite elite forms of knowledge, right? Like Al-Ghazali or Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd or whatever. These, not everybody used to, like now, not everybody reads them, right? It's the same way back when. They're very elite forms of knowledge. It's just what the scholars and the courts and so on used to look at. But Western scholars, when they study the Middle East, only look at that. They don't look at popular forms of Islam, right? Like what the everyday people in the marketplace used to practice, or people, women in the homes, who it's been secluded, what they used to practice and so on. But in Southeast Asia, it's the other way around. So we have this literary tradition. We have Hamza Fansuri and Al-Sinkili and Al-Palambani and Dawood Al-Fatani and all those kinds of people who used to write text in Malay, also in Arabic and so on. But people don't study those texts in the same way. That kind of elite knowledge is overlooked by Western scholars. They might note the existence of the text, they might study the text as an object in itself, produce a critical edition, but they don't study the context of the text and compare it with how orthodox or not is it. Instead, you have anthropologists coming rather than philologists who study the popular Islam. Like people like Clifford Geertz or Walter Skeet back in the 19th century would come here and study everyday Islam. and so you get them talking about bomos and all that kind of thing, right? But then, because the first question I asked myself, when somebody said to me, "Oh well, the Malays, they're not proper Muslims because all this black magic going on."
Yes.
I was thinking, yeah, but there aren't people in the Middle East practicing black magic. There were people in the Middle East practicing black magic. There were Bedouin who practice adat, So why do we single out the Malays as not being proper Muslims when the same kind of things go on in Turkey or in Syria or wherever? And it was that got me motivated to look,
To look more into this Islamization in the Southeast Asia. And I would like to touch a bit just now. I would like to ask for your opinion. How does Islam change the social discourse in early phase in Southeast Asia?
That's a good question. You mean sort of during the Malacca period, for example?
Yes.
That's a good question. I mean, it's difficult to say because we don't necessarily have good sources that tell us a lot about the period and what it was. I mean, we have Sejarah Melayu, and we have the Undang-Undang Malacca, and we have a couple of Arabic accounts of Malacca, but they don't always contain a lot of detail, or the kind of detail that would allow you to. I mean, the Undang-Undang Malacca does, but as I said, it's not been properly studied. I mean, the perception has been, because people have focused on one Arabic account in particular, which talks about, this Ibn Majid went to Malacca, and he complained about, it's very difficult to earn money there. They're all thieves. They eat dogs. They cremate the dead, and they married unbelievers, or they drink alcohol and all that kind of thing, right? But it's difficult to know whether you can trust that. I mean, there's no evidence anywhere of anybody eating dogs in Malacca or any time in Indonesia or in the Malay Peninsula or in Borneo or anywhere. There's no evidence, archaeological evidence, that anyone's ever done that. So sort of complaining about losing money. I mean, all merchants lose money, right, when they go to somewhere, when they're not used to it, and it seems strange. We know that from the Portuguese sources, from Tomé Pires and people like that, Albuquerque, when they conquered Malacca, that there was intermarriage between Malays and non-Malays, particularly Chinese, but that was a way of converting people. So the Muslim Malays would marry their daughters to a Chinese person, for example, a Chinese merchant, because she would then convert her husband. It was a way of Islamizing
the spreading of Islam.
Yeah, it was a way of spreading Islam. So we don't know how much of that we can rely upon. And the same with the Undang-Undang Malacca, for example. Everybody thinks of this as an Adat-dominated text, which it is. But that ignores what the purpose of that text is, because the Undang-Undang Malacca describes itself as Kanun, right? As Kanun law, right? Kanun Malacca. Kanun is a particular type of Islamic law. It's not Sharia. It's because with Sharia, with the hudud, right, it's not always possible to enforce the hudud, right? So if you have the hudud for theft, for example, right, the had for theft, there are 14 conditions that need to be reached before you can implement that law. So the person needs to have stolen something worth a certain amount of money. They need to be over a certain age. You have to be able to prove that they went to the place where the object was with the intention of stealing it, that they entered without permission the house, that they took the item out, that they took it away, all those kinds of things, right? If you can't establish even one of those points, then you can't implement the had, right? So when that's the case, what do? Well, you have to have the discretionary punishments instead, right? I mean, something's been stolen, this person was involved, so what do? And that's what the Kanun law was for. It was for these discretionary punishments. And many of these discretionary punishments that you see in the Undang-Undang Malacca are the same as ones you see in Kanun literature from the Ottoman Empire from the same period. So people always look for the one for theft. I picked that one deliberately because the punishment in the Undang-Undang Malacca is to put somebody sitting backwards on the donkey, smear their face with turmeric, and then lead them around the marketplace, telling everybody what they did, right? People, scholars, Western scholars, look at this and say, this isn't Islamic, this is terrible. The Islamic punishment is to amputate the hand or whatever. But in Ottoman Kanun, exactly the same punishment is very common. You find it in Damascus, for example, where somebody's, when you can't prove that they've stolen, or, have met all the conditions for the had punishment, you put them on the back of a donkey, but you smear their face with charcoal rather than turmeric and lead them around. It's the same thing. So So yeah, it's difficult to tell from the sources because, as I said, they haven't been studied properly. But it does seem that from that example that I gave you, that Islam had far more of an impact on Malacca than is currently assumed by Western scholars. This idea that it was syncretic and nobody really practiced Islam isn't really supported when you take a deep look at the Undang-Undang Malacca. And certainly the early Chinese sources like Ma Huan, who accompanied Cheng He, he talks about how religious people were in Malacca, and that they all practiced Islam properly and they pray 5 times a day and fasted and all that kind of thing. So there are conflicting accounts, and it depends on how you choose to read the early accounts.
And do you believe that, with Islamization, especially in the Southeast Asia, does it impose challenge, especially to the non-Muslim, in retaining their culture, for example?
During the early period?
During the early period.
No, I don't think it did. I mean, one of the reasons that Islam was so successful in spreading through Southeast Asia as opposed to Christianity, for example, because when the Christians first arrived, the Portuguese and the Spanish, Portuguese in 1511, and the Spanish a little bit later in the Philippines, the reason why, I mean, at that point, Islam was, spreading through Sumatra and the peninsula and northern Borneo and so on, but in eastern Indonesia, in Ternate and Maluku and those places, Sulawesi, they were still pagan, right? So the reason that those areas became Muslim and not Christian is because of the different attitudes towards people who weren't Muslim or weren't Christian, what the attitude that was taken. So Muslims would go to the region, come to Southeast Asia, they would settle down with Malay people, for example, learn the language, intermarry.
So it's more that they're trying to assimilate.
They tried to assimilate. Exactly. So and the locals started to assimilate. So we know from Spanish sources that the Filipinos in Luzon around Manila, because Manila was a Muslim settlement then, they were starting to Islamize. They were starting to not eat pork and so on. They were gradually taking on these Islamic ideas because the Muslims were living with them as equals. Whereas the Christians came in and just killed everyone and said, you have to learn our language, you have to trade with us, you can only, you have to practice our laws, all the rest of it. And that turned people off. So, there's another case that this is actually in Africa, I think in Eastern Africa. I forget the name of the kingdom, but it was at the same period, and it illustrates the point that I'm making, that there was this pagan king there and there was a Muslim missionary and a Christian missionary trying to compete over converting it. And the Christian, who's a Jesuit, was saying, "Oh well, if you convert to Christianity, you can go to heaven and be there forever, and it'll be great." And the king says, "Well, if I convert to Christianity, will you be in heaven as well?" And all the Portuguese, they say, "Of course we will." So in that case, I'm going to convert because I don't like you. I don't want to be in heaven with you forever. And he converted to Islam instead. So yeah.
So I'd like to touch a bit on the challenges of your research topic, because you're based in United Kingdom, right?
Yes.
So you do a lot of research about the Southeast Asia. So do you come across challenges? Like, how do you usually conduct your research?
It can be challenging. Most of my research is based on old texts. So either I have to use quite often, because often those texts are here in Southeast Asia, in Libya and Jakarta, for example, or here in KL, and they can be difficult to access. But often they've just not been studied properly. So the Royal Library of Banten, for example, the Sultanate of Banten in Western Java, that survives. So that's one of the biggest collections of Islamic texts in the world from the pre-modern period, and yet it's hardly been studied at all, and it's quite difficult to access. It's in the National Library in Jakarta. But this can be because it's not been digitized, so scholars in the West find it difficult to access these things and know exactly what it says, and who was talking to who in that early period and so on.
So that means that the materials are there, it's just that the access to it are quite difficult.
Yes, in that case, yes, certainly. When you're studying Malacca, there's very few texts out there, right? It's basically the Sejarah Melayu Hikayat Hang Tuah, which is a late text, and then the Undang-Undang Malacca. All the copies we have of that are quite late, they're all 19th century, and they were copied by British people, or for British people, so they reflect what British people thought was important. So the British thought that the Sejarah Melayu, or Surat al-Salatin, was an important text, and therefore they asked people to copy it for them. But whether the Malays of that time thought that it was as important, or whether they preferred something else, which has since been lost, we don't know. So there's that limitation as well.
And with that, I would like to touch a bit, like bring it to the modern context. So, do you have research or even study in the modern Islamic in the Southeast Asia?
Yes, so there's how that early history shapes kind of understandings of what it means to be Malay today,
Mm-hmm.
and the relationship particularly between Malays and the Chinese. So, I mean, the idea of what it is to be Malay and fusing the idea of being Malay with being Muslim originates with the period, the Malacca period. And it's interesting to see how that spreads, that spread through the pre-modern period, not just in the peninsula here, but across into Sumatra and even northern Java and so on. Because I think one of the challenges for people studying Islam in Southeast Asia today, or just studying Southeast Asia today, is that quite often, I mean, we divide it right between Malaysia and Indonesia,
Yes.
but those divisions work well in the post-independence period, but earlier than that, and for understanding people's long-term cultural relationships with each other, it doesn't make much sense because there were Malay people all across Indonesia, right?
Yes.
And they wouldn't have divided themselves in that way, 200 years ago, for example. So you have to try and find a way to bring people back together. Similarly with the Chinese element, I mean, it's interesting to study Hang Li Po, for example, and the influence that she had during the Malacca period. And it's interesting to see as well how, attitudes towards being Malay have changed. So, I mean, one interesting historical figure from Malacca, but from the Dutch period, is Datuk Harun, who was the first Captain Melayu of Dutch Malacca. So, when the Portuguese were in control of Malacca, they wouldn't allow Muslims, mosques or anything like that. But when the Dutch came in, was it 1626 or whenever it was, they weren't interested in religion, they were interested in making money, so they allowed the Muslims to come back and to re-establish mosques and all that kind of thing. And Datuk Harun, as the head of the Malay community, he established the first mosques in Malacca, since the Sultanate. He established Wakaf, he established burial grounds. He's buried now in Malacca, you see a big Batu Aceh, all that kind of thing. But when you look at the Dutch records, he was Chinese, he was first generation Chinese from Guangzhou, from Canton. But he was considered to be Malay by the Malay community. He considered himself to be Malay, and so on. It's interesting to see, that the racial identities, the ethnic identities in Malaysia were quite fluid once upon a time. But since the British colonial period, when the British, taking their censuses, made people decide either you're Chinese or you're Malay, and so on, and treated people differently as a result. It ended that kind of sense of being, a fluid identity of Masuk Melayu when you convert to Islam. So there's that. Is that the idea is, comparing between the modern, what we have now, and the earlier period, and seeing how it's changed and why it's changed, and how can we learn from what happened in the past, and how can we make things better in the future by doing that.
And previously, I did some reading about your research, and you did a lot previously. You talk about the politics, the influence of Islam into the local politics, for example, the one that in Malaysia. So I would like to ask for your opinion. What role does political play in navigating the space between modernity and also Islam?
I think the role that Islam plays in politics, I mean, it's always going to be different than it is in the West. Where I come from, it's very secular, so Christianity plays no role in politics. Whereas here, I mean, the nature of Islam is such that it is always going to play a role of some form in public life. I think the problem in Malaysia, and I say this from my time having worked here, and also from researching and writing a couple of articles and so on, is that where you have different parties which identify as Islamic, then they start trying to out-Islamize each other, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because it can push people towards being more religious, right, and be more observant and wanting to follow, the rules properly and so on, and not just ignoring it. Certainly during the early independence period of Malaysia, right, people weren't so bothered about religion. So that's good from that point of view, but it can also lead to takfirism, right, where people start accusing each other of not being Muslim enough, of not being a proper Muslim. When you can't out-Islamize somebody, when you can't be more Muslim, then the answer is to say, oh, they're not really Muslims anyway. And that becomes then a problem, because, I mean, obviously takfirism is you shouldn't do that. I mean, there are hadith about that and so on. So it can become a source of conflict between Muslims, right? and the Ummah should be united. So when it goes down that conservative road, when people start ignoring the advice of the Prophet and saying one Muslim cannot call another Muslim an unbeliever, or not being Muslim enough, then it can become a source of conflict between the Muslim community, which is a bad thing, right? Because I mean, if you look at the situation in Israel and Palestine now, I mean, I know Jews. I work with some Jews in St Andrews, and I like them, and they're appalled by the state of the Palestinian people and think it's all terrible. But the Jewish community is always united, right? Even when they don't agree with each other, they're always united. Whereas the danger is with when you get this takfirism going on, is that the Muslim community, even when they should be united, end up being divided because they can't agree on anything. So I think it does have that drawback.
And as we are reaching the end of this conversation, obviously, you know a lot about the Islamization in the Southeast Asia, and perhaps we have listeners coming from academics background. I'd like to ask for your opinion. In which area of interest do you think that there is potential to explore more and need more attention?
In Southeast Asia studies?
Yes.
I think the Sultan of Malacca is next. I mean, how many books have been written about the Sultan of Malacca? I mean, it's very few. I think people should, and also, I mean, I would love to see a series of books on each of the states in Malaysia, right? The Sultanate of Kelantan, the Sultanate of Perlis.
So each history of the Sultan.
Of each one, and going back, in a sophisticated, modern, academic way, looking at, the social development, the economic development, the cultural development, the relationships between those places and so on, because people don't write enough about their own history in Malaysia. In Indonesia, maybe, particularly on Java, it's a little bit better, but here in Malaysia, there isn't enough emphasis on, I mean, even at IIUM, right? I mean, they're always teaching European history or something. It's never Southeast Asian history or, Middle Eastern history at IIUM. So that, I think, I would love to see that, the studies of these different sultanates in depth.
But you do see the difference between how do they perceive the one that, for example, in Indonesia and also Philippines, is there any difference in their perception about their country's history?
Yeah, I think Indonesians are perhaps they engage a bit more. I mean, there's a lot of interest in Malaysia about their history, particularly about Malacca. People always want to know about Malacca.
Yes.
And always interested in it. And when the book comes out, they're going to read it. But people aren't encouraged to study it at universities. Everybody has to do the science stream and go and do engineering at university, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so there aren't many historians out there. And those historians there are out there, they're doing the post-independence period, aren't they? From the Second World War onwards, from the Japanese occupation onwards. Whereas I think in Indonesia, certainly in the past anyway, there's been more of an emphasis on writing about history to create a sense of Indonesian identity, which was harder in Indonesia than it was in Malaysia. Because Malaysia is more united, isn't it, with the Malay states, whereas Indonesia is far more diverse. So they had to do that. And so, I mean, in the independence period in Malaysia, there were some great historians, Kukai Kim, Alatas, so on and so forth, who could hold their head up high with anybody in the Western world. But now there's far fewer people like that. So yeah.
And with that being said, I would like to thank Dr. Amin for his insight on today's topic, exploring Islamic civilization in Southeast Asia. And we hope that today's sharing will be beneficial and also inspiring to our listeners. And again, Doctor, thank you for being with us in the studio. Assalamualaikum.